Our next session examines the First Amendment on the edge, new, controversial, and outlier approaches. Moderating this session will be Andy Conte, founding director of the Center for Media Innovation at Point Park University. Mr. Conte writes the Pittsburgh Public Editor column at Next Pittsburgh and was previously an investigative journalist for the Pittsburgh Tribune Review. Our panel for this session includes James O'Keefe and Salena Zito, and I invite them to the stage. Investigative journalist and writer James O'Keefe is founder and president of Project Veritas, a nonprofit organization which states that its mission is to investigate and expose corruption, dishonesty, self-dealing, waste, fraud, and other misconduct in public and private institutions in order to achieve a more ethical and transparent society. Salena Zito is a CNN political analyst, a reporter, and a columnist for the Washington Examiner, and a columnist for the New York Post. A Pittsburgh native, she is co-author of the 2018 book, The Great Revolt: Inside the Populist Coalition, Reshaping American Politics.
Good afternoon. So I promised at the beginning, I promised James backstage that I wouldn't joke about whether he had cameras hidden all over his person. But I can say, James, that I acted all day as if you did. I think that's got to be part of the standard. So when people talk about the work you do, there's no question that if you look at the results, that you catch people saying things that they wouldn't say normally if they knew a journalist was in the room. If they knew they were talking to a journalist, they wouldn't behave in the way that they do. And I think people are open to that. They're willing to see that, hypocrisy, duplicity, those things are, when you uncover those are part of bedrocks of journalism. But where you lose a lot of journalists are the methods that you go about doing it, where you send somebody in to pose as something they are not. Can you talk about why you do that? Talk about your methodology.
Well, first of all, I'm going to answer your question about that, but let me first tell you a bit about why I'm here. I'm not here to seek recognition from established media. I don't seek your praise, and I don't really care what the established media thinks of me. I'm here because I recognize the power that's inherent in mainstream media. Okay, our stories can't succeed unless they get in the mainstream media. That's our mission. And this week, we were on every single TV station in Missouri after we caught Claire McCaskill and her staffers. Every TV station. I understand that the media has more power than all three branches of government, because an informed citizenry is what makes that power.
Well, so then do you feel like you're part of the story by going out and, so you come up with a clip, you challenge somebody, you get them on TV, then other journalists pick up your story?
Well, I think it has a lot to do with what constitutes a compelling public interest. And a lot of people in the media don't think there's anything wrong with the media, but the media is not very popular amongst the American people. So what we did, and what journalists have a problem with, Andy, is we went undercover into the media itself. I mean, who's going to guard the guardsmen? Brian Stelter seems like a nice guy, but I don't think so. Someone has to hold them accountable. If the media has more power than all three branches of government, and many people in history have said that, who is going to hold them accountable?
But on your question, so address the question of methodology then.
So I will. So we go undercover, because you had asked me about Dean Baquet, executive editor of the New York Times, and posing as a victim in the Washington Post. We go undercover into CNN. We find a CNN producer in Atlanta who says that the Russia story is for ratings. Brian Stelter in Atlanta said that the CEO of CNN said in an internal meeting, it's all about the ratings. In his words, it was, and I quote, the Russia story was, and I quote, bullshit, unquote. His words, not mine. I don't report anything unless you can see and hear it coming out of people's own mouths. That's a standard that's well above and beyond Bob Woodward, who quotes anonymous sources relaying information from another anonymous sources months after the fact and uses poetic license by putting that in quotation marks.
But address the issue of methodology then. So, I mean, you've established, and I think, I acknowledge that from the beginning, people, it's clear that, your results, the things that people say, they've acknowledged that, yes, people say things differently when they're in private. But why do you send in people, reporters, the Washington Post case that you just referenced?
Well, we sent in somebody who was a reporter because
who posed as a victim.
Due to the extraordinary urgency of the circumstances and how broken we think the media has become, and this is not a right-wing sentiment. You can go ahead and read Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent to understand the perverse economic incentives that exist in the media, the pressure that advertisers put on people. This is not a right-wing methodology. You can go back and read Edward Bernays' propaganda. You can read Walter Niebuhr talk about the stupidity of the average man. We went into the Washington Post for one reason, to draw people out. Look at the history of undercover journalism. You have people posing as longshoremen. You have the Chicago Sun-Times, which is denied a Pulitzer Prize for posing as a bartender for 9 months. You look at the history, people posed as drug traffickers. We posed as pimps, prostitutes, telephone technicians. It's always to draw an honest conversation out of the person we're talking to. And I unequivocally and categorically deny that I ever tried to plant a fake story, ever. If you go back and read the original Washington Post story, they did not report that. Those were motives that were falsely attributed to me after the fact. And I would go under oath, as would my entire staff, if given the opportunity. I would go under oath to say that.
But you feel like, well, I'm going to get to Salena in a moment because I don't want you to just sit between us. And
It's like a ping pong
beautiful,
game.
yeah.
It's been good. Now I know what the ping pong net feels like.
Just one last question on that point. Do you feel like you can't get into those conversations unless you go in with duplicitous, or you go in as under false pretenses?
You can't, people are not going to be honest oftentimes. It's like what veteran journalist Ken Aletta said, that politicians are going to make it really hard for you to know what they're actually thinking and doing. So this is his words, not mine. You need to bribe and seduce them. I mean, spare me that this is not about journalism ethics, okay? This is about power. This is about who you are allowed to investigate, because if we were doing this to the NRA or to anti-abortionists, y'all would be singing my praises.
So let's hear it from Salena's perspective, because I think you speak with a lot of people who feel like they don't have a voice, who aren't heard. How do you do it? Do you go in? Do you ever pose as something else? And what's your methodology for getting stories out of people?
No, I'm always Salena Zito. It's boring. So I approach journalism sort of the way that you used to when there were a lot of smaller newspapers, where I try to go into a community or into a region and sort of become part of the community and listen to what the concerns are. That's especially been my approach covering politics. I was blessed to be able to do that when I worked for the Pittsburgh Tribune Review. I was able to travel around, and when I interview people, or when I go to a town, say I'm covering the presidential election, or I'm covering, or how I'm currently covering the midterm elections, I usually go to a town a couple of days ahead of time, or a region. I don't fly. I don't take highways. I take the back roads, so I can understand what's happening in a community, not just in the town, but also along the way, to see how things have changed economically, either positively. How are the suburbs doing? Is there growth there? Is there sprawl there? How's that impacting the local economy? Is there technology there? But also, is there decay there? Have things fallen apart? Has industry left? How has that impacted the schools, the education, the churches, the communities, and the families' lives? Has it broken families up? And so when I understand that, then you start to understand how you talk to people about how they're voting, where their sentiments are. That's how I understood what was going to happen in 2016. I actually wrote a story for the Trib at the time. I went to 10 counties in Pennsylvania and understood that these 10 counties were going to flip. And all they needed to do was change 2,000 more votes than they did in 2012, and that the election in Pennsylvania was over. And if it was over in Pennsylvania, then that meant it was over in Wisconsin, Michigan, North Carolina, and Florida, states that were, and also Ohio and Iowa.
Salena, how do you, so it's, because you're from Western Pennsylvania, you're here, you can talk to people here in an authentic way, but whenever you go to another community, you're in Louisiana or you're in Texas or somewhere, what makes you different than the ordinary journalist who goes in and tries to talk to the residents?
Well, I try to make sure that I really understand what's going on in a community. And I always make sure I reach out to like a local development or the chamber or the local churches, so I understand, what's important in this community, what are people hungry for, what's failing and what's prospering. And that's sort of how you understand what's going on. I think the most important thing to do as a journalist is to listen. Just listen to what people are telling you. I understood that the Republicans are having a populist new coalition forming, but I also have written extensively about how the Democrats will also have a populist coalition forming. That party is changing as well, and I still don't think we're listening to it in a meaningful way in understanding what's happening to the Democratic Party.
James, can you talk about the perspective you bring to your stories? That's one of the criticisms another criticism that journalists have is that you come at these stories from a conservative perspective. Do you feel like those voices are being heard, or like Salena's saying that that's another problem?
I think that the criticism of an agenda is irrelevant. I mean, ultimately what matters is what the person is saying, and truth is paramount. And when it comes to the purity of journalism, and the closest thing to journalism is we use videotape. It's videotaped evidence. It's the irrefutability of what we do that people don't like. It doesn't leave room for interpretation. Images transfix in a way that words don't. You can hear the intonation, you can hear the cadence, there's no disagreement, and I think that is the irrefutability of what we do that upsets people. If you look at the history of journalism, Upton Sinclair, if you read his biography, he was an avowed socialist, more power to him. If you look at undercover people, there have been people who've done this, they stopped doing it in the last 25 years. If you look at people, there's a reporter named Günter Wohlruf, and he actually infiltrated a German newspaper by being a reporter. And he had an agenda. His agenda was workers' rights so that the workers could strike. I don't think motive and agenda and political philosophy is relevant. I don't think that should be part of the calculation. The only thing that matters is what it is that you are reporting and whether or not it's true. All this discussion about ethics is besides the point, because it really the discussion about the ethics is a subjective one. Because what matters is what constitutes a compelling public interest. And that's what this is really about. It's about what constitutes that interest.
Do you, just so we all know, do you have any journalists embedded in any newspapers across the country now?
Do we have people embedded in newspapers?
Yeah, any of your reporters?
Well, we're not going to acknowledge, we have a video coming out tomorrow on another United States senator. But if you have integrity, if there's no difference between how you project yourself to the world and what you say, you shouldn't be worried about people like me. If people had integrity, they shouldn't be paranoid.
Can you, so address the one issue, the veracity that you just talked about. Some people say, well, but he's selective in the way he cuts the videos, the way he shows the videos. Address that.
Selective editing. All journalism is edited selectively so. Newspaper people select their words and they arrange them in sentences to paint an elaborate portrait. But I mean, you talk about gutter standards. There's a quote in the Washington Post I read, quote, "There is no evidence that he did not say the things attributed to him," unquote, in the Wolf Book. How are you supposed to disprove a negative? In the last 2 weeks, I've seen NBC News apologize for editing Trump's comments. I've seen CNN retract multiple stories. The Washington Post, Carol Leonnig, retracted 2 headlines about me. They said I went after Acorn because I was motivated by an animus of African Americans. She retracted that. You don't read Carol Leonnig, who retracted a story about James O'Keefe. In other words, our honesty and our integrity, the ratio of I've never had to retract a story. There's only 2 edits people are upset about. That's me not wearing a pimp costume when I said I wanted to start brothels.
That was the Acorn
Pimp
situation,
protocol
right?
does not require the wearing of pimp costumes to be a pimp. And then the second was with the NPR investigation with a scene change. We've done 100 undercover investigations, and those are the only 2 edits that people can attack me for. When ABC, NBC, and CBS constantly retract, get sued for defamation, and settle.
So,
I have never
yeah.
settled, let me just say one more thing.
Yeah.
I have never settled a defamation lawsuit. Other news organizations have settled them with me. And that's an important
the case
fact.
with Acorn, you said there was a settlement with that, though, right?
That was over invasion of privacy, not defamation.
Okay.
Not defamation. People say, well, you settled a defamation lawsuit. It was about invasion of privacy, California statute 632.
Okay.
It was about the constitutionality of recording somebody.
So James, I want to, Selena's on the panel too. You get stuck in the middle with the
Ping pong net.
But
I know how it feels.
Talk about voice, because that's one of the things that I know you have over the years gone from being a reporter at times to being a columnist at times. For the public, reporters deal in facts, where columnists sometimes can bring in their own opinion to it. So how do you distinguish between those multiple voices when you're talking?
So when I first started at the Pittsburgh Tribune Review, I sat at my desk and I wrote opinion pieces, and I was pretty bored by 3 months. I was like, who cares what I think? So I thought that a more interesting way to look at it was to go out and interview people and tell the story with both sides as to what is going on. And if you look at any of my work at the New York Post or at the Washington Examiner, there's always both sides to the piece, so that I want people to figure it out themselves. And so that's sort of what I evolved to over in the past 15 years.
Right.
So my pieces don't have my opinion in them, but they will have your opinion in them. And then people can figure out, well, what does that mean to me in my life? And what does that mean in terms of how I view things?
Yeah. James, when you do your pieces, do you feel like your opinion comes through? Is that,
No.
How much does it motivate that?
It doesn't.
Okay.
It doesn't come through.
How about in
because-
choosing your targets, though? Because
Okay, we go after the sacred cows, the groups that the media refuses to investigate. I mean,
But
it's-
only from a conservative perspective.
well, you could
right?
say that a lot of media outlets are entirely monolithic in who they go after, and if that's their standard, then I guess then we ought to be investigating more and more organizations. But my view can't come through. It's the purest form of journalism to capture someone in their own words. Y'all laughed when I said I settled a lawsuit for invasion of privacy. This is a First Amendment conference. You're in a two-party consent state to film, Pennsylvania. In California, it's the same thing. I get sued for invading the privacy of a worker, a pseudo-government worker that gets taxpayer funds, who tells me that the girls can cross the border in Tijuana. The lawsuit was not over editing. It was over invasion of privacy.
So-
and I fought that
Yeah.
in federal court, and I lost. But to answer your question, that intent, my opinion, is completely irrelevant. What matters is what is being exposed. And if it's real, that's all that matters. More power to the people who have agendas, as long as they're reporting the facts.
Right.
And it's real, and that's why we call it Veritas, a cinema verite.
Salena, can you talk about this all feels very jammed up because we don't have a ton of time, but I don't want to let this panel go without giving you a chance to talk about the work you're doing at Harvard now, because it's an innovative way of interacting with, are they even journalism students that you're teaching? Or
There are a variety of different students. So I do this really cool thing at Harvard University. It's called the Main Street Project. They had come to me last year and asked me to be a visiting fellow. And I was like, Salena Zito in Cambridge? I don't think so. And also I missed Sunday dinner with my family, which is like really important. So I politely declined. And then they came back and they said, well, we really want to do something with you. And I said, well, I could take the students out with me. And they're like, what? I'm like, yeah, why don't I take the students out with me? These are the best and the brightest in the country, right? If you're going to Harvard, you're probably going to be running something in this world. And so why don't they do better than the past two generations have done and get out of the bubble? Most of my students were from Boston or Manhattan or Los Angeles and had never been to the middle of the country. So they're like, yeah, let's do this. The kids had to compete to be into the class. There were 30 that were accepted. No planes, no interstates. They only did back roads, which was very challenging in the winter. But, you know, they lived in places like Youngstown, Ohio. They worked in a steel mill. They worked at the Fiesta Ware factory. They went to church here in Pittsburgh before they left. You know, they went on calls with the police and they saw the opioid addiction front and center. They saw the administration of Zarcan. They also went to the gun range. They went with an NRA instructor. They learned about firearm safety.
I'm sorry to cut you off. We are running out of time. So
yes.
Yeah, I know joy's looming. I still have time left, though.
46 seconds.
James, from your perspective, so Salena at Harvard, James O'Keefe at a First Amendment conference with Dean Baquet and Marty Barron. What has this meant for you to be here?
I think it's important for people to know the truth. I'm not making emotional arguments. I'm making rational arguments. And the quote that hangs on my office wall is that the famous quote, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends." There is a storied tradition of undercover journalism. This past week, Claire McCaskill called for a special prosecutor to come after me. Where is the media? You have to practice some introspection. You have to understand the ironies inherent in your calling for off with his head and inquisitions. At the end of the day, the only thing that matters is what's on the tape. Stay tuned tomorrow because there's another United States Senator coming.
Okay.
Videotape, and it's the irrefutability that scares the hell out of
Salena,
me.
I want to give you a
This
chance
is
for
my
a listen.
third First Amendment conference to speak at this year. One in Memphis, one in Factoryville, Pennsylvania. I write about the First Amendment every year. I write about Constitution Day every year. think it's really important, and I'm really excited to be here.
So I think there's one thing we can all agree on. This panel was way too short. Could have got much longer. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.